The world, for Ilara Vance, had become a collection of things that no longer worked. In the basement of the Miller Street archives, the air was a thick, stagnant soup of paper dust and the sour tang of old leather. It was a subterranean kingdom of the forgotten, and Ilara was its silent queen. She sat at a scarred oak workbench, the glow of a single halogen lamp casting long, skeletal shadows against the brick walls. Her fingers, stained with the ink of a century ago, moved with the precision of a surgeon's as she teased apart the fused pages of a 1920s blueprint. She lived in the minutiae, the way a certain grade of vellum felt beneath a thumb, brittle like a dragonfly's wing, the specific, rhythmic scratch of her scalpel against adhesive. The silence of the basement was not empty, it was heavy. It was a silence that had settled into her bones over the 5 years since her father's architectural firm had collapsed in a heap of scandal and debt, taking his spirit and her future with it. On the corner of her desk sat the only thing she hadn't been able to fix, a silver pocket watch. Its crystal was webbed with cracks, and the internal gears were jammed by a fine, microscopic silt of red clay, the soil of the construction site where her father's life had effectively ended. She didn't try to wind it anymore. She just liked the weight of it in her palm. It was a reminder that time could stop, even if the rest of the world kept screaming forward. The bell above the heavy steel door chimed, a rare, intrusive sound that made Ilara's heart kick against her ribs. She didn't look up immediately. She finished the stroke she was making, exhaling a slow, controlled breath. Then she raised her head. Standing at the base of the concrete stairs was a woman who looked like she had been carved from a block of expensive, unyielding ice. She wore a coat of charcoal cashmere that seemed to repel the dust of the basement. Her hair was a helmet of silver blonde, and her eyes were the color of a winter sea. "Ilara Vance?" the woman asked. Her voice was like the snap of a frozen branch. "Yes," Ilara said, her own voice sounding thin and unused to her ears. "I am Eleanor Sterling." The name hit the room like a physical weight. Everyone in the city knew the Sterlings. They were the architects of the new skyline, the titans of glass and steel. They were also the people who had absorbed her father's failing company for pennies on the dollar, effectively erasing his name from the records of the city he had helped build. "I know who you are," Ilara said, her grip tightening on the scalpel. Eleanor Sterling didn't move. She didn't apologize for the intrusion or the history between their names. She simply surveyed the cramped, dim workshop with a look of clinical detachment. "You have a reputation for restoration, not just of paper, but of environments. I'm told you can describe a room so vividly that a person feels the texture of the walls without touching them." Ilara frowned. "I'm an architectural historian, Mrs. Sterling. I reconstruct what's been lost." "Good," Eleanor said, stepping closer. The scent of her perfume, something expensive, sharp and cold, cut through the smell of the archives. "Because my son has lost everything. 6 months ago, an accident at the Hudson site took his sight. It also took his will to engage with the world he spent his life designing." Ilara felt a strange, unwelcome tug of empathy. She knew what it was like to have your world go dark, even if hers had been a metaphorical eclipse. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm not a doctor." "Julian doesn't need a doctor. He has a dozen." "He needs eyes," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a low, commanding register. "He refuses to leave his suite. He refuses to look at blueprints, to authorize designs, to even acknowledge the change in the seasons. He is drifting into a vacuum of his own making. I want to hire you to be his narrator." Ilara shook her head, a small, bitter laugh escaping her. "You want me to read to him?" "No, I want you to live at the Sterling estate. I want you to walk the grounds with him. I want you to describe the world to him, the light, the materials, the shadows, in a way that makes him want to be part of it again. You have the vocabulary of an architect and the patience of a saint, if your employment records are any indication. I will pay you $10,000 a week. The number hung in the air, a shimmering, impossible thing. It was more than Ilara earned in a year. It was enough to pay off the remaining liens on her father's name. It was enough to buy her way out of this basement. "Why me?" Ilara asked, her voice trembling. "There are hundreds of people who could do this." Eleanor Sterling stepped into the circle of light cast by the halogen lamp. For the first time, Ilara saw the hairline fractures in the woman's composure, the slight tremor in her gloved hand. "Because you are a Vance," Eleanor whispered. "You understand what it means to lose a legacy, and because you are invisible, you have no social life, no family left, no reason to talk to the press. You will be a ghost in my house. You will speak only when spoken to, and you will never, under any circumstances, try to fix him. You are there to describe, Ilara, not to heal. Julian is difficult. He does not want pity, and he certainly does not want a friend." "I don't need a friend either," Ilara said, her eyes drifting back to the broken silver watch on her desk. "Then we have an understanding," Eleanor said. "A car will be here at 6 tomorrow morning. Bring only what you need. The estate provides everything else." Without waiting for a final confirmation, Eleanor Sterling turned and ascended the stairs, her heels clicking a sharp final rhythm against the concrete. The following morning, the city was draped in a funeral shroud of grey fog. Ilara stood on the curb with a single, battered suitcase, watching as a sleek black sedan pulled up silently. The driver didn't speak. He simply took her bag and opened the door. As the car wound its way out of the cramped, brick-lined streets of her neighborhood and toward the heights of the Sterling estate, Ilara felt a rising sense of dread. The estate was located on a cliffside overlooking the Hudson, a fortress of modernism designed by Julian Sterling himself before the accident. When the gates swung open, Ilara saw it, a sprawling structure of cantilevered concrete, floor-to-ceiling glass, and black steel. It was beautiful, but it was a cold beauty. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a monument to an ego that had been frozen in time. The interior was even more imposing. The floors were polished white marble that echoed every footstep, making Ilara feel like an intruder in a cathedral. The walls were hung with minimalist art, stark black lines on white canvases. There were no photos, no clutter, no signs of life. The air was climate-controlled to a precise, chilling temperature. "This way," a housekeeper murmured, leading Ilara up a floating glass staircase. They reached a set of heavy, soundproof doors at the end of a long gallery. The housekeeper stopped, her face an unreadable mask. "Mr. Sterling is in the solarium. He hasn't had breakfast. He hasn't spoken since yesterday morning. Do not touch him. Do not move the furniture. And whatever you do, do not mention the light." Ilara took a breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. She pushed the doors open. The solarium was a massive room with 3 walls of glass, offering a panoramic view of the river. But the motorized shades were drawn tight, plunging the space into a thick, suffocating twilight. The only sound was the low, persistent hum of the ventilation system. In the center of the room, sitting in a chair of black leather and chrome, was a man. Julian Sterling was younger than Ilara had imagined, perhaps 32. He was dressed in a charcoal turtleneck that made his pale skin look almost translucent. His features were sharp, aristocratic, and set in a mask of profound, icy stillness. His eyes were open, a piercing, clouded grey, but they didn't track the movement of the door. They stared fixedly at a point 3 inches above the horizon, seeing nothing. He didn't turn his head when she entered. He didn't acknowledge the shift in the air. "The light is hitting the dust motes near the door," Ilara said, her voice barely a whisper, testing the weight of the silence. They looked like tiny silver sparks floating in a vacuum. Julian's jaw tightened. A small muscle leapt in his cheek. "I didn't ask for a poet," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, unused and edged with a bitterness that made the room feel even colder. "And I certainly didn't ask for you." Ilara stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the man who had built a world of light and was now drowning in the dark, and she realized that the silence in this room was far heavier than the silence in her basement. This was a silence that wanted to swallow them both. "I'm not a poet, Mr. Sterling," Ilara said, taking a cautious step forward, the marble cool even through the soles of her shoes. "I'm the person who's going to tell you exactly what you're missing." Julian's hand, resting on the arm of the chair, curled into a fist. "I'm missing nothing," he spat, "because there is nothing left worth seeing." He turned his head then, unerringly toward the sound of her voice, and though his eyes were vacant, Ilara felt a jolt of pure electric tension. It was the look of a man who was ready to fight a ghost. "We'll see about that," Ilara whispered. The first cliffhanger of her new life had arrived. She was in the heart of the enemy's palace, standing before a man who was a masterpiece of wreckage. And for the first time in 5 years, the silver watch in her pocket felt like it might actually be capable of ticking again. For the first 3 days, Julian Sterling treated Ilara like a piece of software that had been installed incorrectly. The routine was as rigid as the steel beams that held the house aloft. At precisely 8 in the morning, Ilara would enter the solarium. The shades were always down, the air always filtered to a sterile, scentless chill. Julian would be sitting in the same black leather chair, his posture so perfect it looked painful. He never greeted her. He waited for the sound of her footsteps to stop, for the rustle of her coat to settle, and then he would speak, his voice like a dull blade. "Describe the fireplace," he would say, or "the northeast corner of the mezzanine, materials and dimensions. Go." It was a test. He knew every inch of this house. He had designed it, after all. He was checking for accuracy, for flaws in her perception. He wanted to catch her in a lie, to prove that her vision was as useless as his own. Ilara stood by the heavy oak table, her fingers subconsciously brushing the silver watch in her pocket. The metal was cold, a small anchor in the vast, echoing silence of the room. "The fireplace is a monolithic block of honed basalt," she began, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered. "It's 6 feet wide, recessed 4 inches into the primary structural wall. The stone is charcoal, almost blue where the shadow hits the grain. There are no seams. It looks like a piece of the earth's crust that was cut out and polished until it forgot it was ever wild." Julian's fingers flickered on the armrest. "Basalt," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "The thermal mass is high. It should hold the heat of the morning sun, but I don't feel it." "The shades are down, Mr. Sterling," Ilara reminded him softly. "I know the shades are down," he snapped, his head whipping toward her. The clouded grey of his eyes seemed to burn with a sudden, localized fire. "I am blind, Vance, not stupid. I am aware of the barriers between me and the world." The silence that followed was thick, flavored with his resentment. Ilara didn't flinch. She had spent years in a basement with the ghosts of failed dreams. She was not afraid of a man's anger. "If you want to feel the thermal mass, you have to let the light in," she said. Julian's face went white. He turned away, his jaw working. "Don't mention the light. My mother told you the rules. She told me not to fix you. She didn't say I couldn't be honest." "Honesty is a luxury for those who can afford the truth," Julian whispered. He reached for a small porcelain cup on the side table. His hand moved with a practiced, robotic precision, but as he lifted it, Ilara noticed a tremor. It wasn't the tremor of age or infirmity. It was the sluggishness of someone whose nervous system was being suppressed. A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Halloway, the housekeeper, entered with a silver tray. On it was a small glass of water and a single blue pill. "Time for your supplement, Mr. Julian," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. Julian took the pill without a word. He swallowed it with a mechanical gulp, his eyes losing some of their sharp, bitter clarity almost instantly. Within 10 minutes, his shoulders slumped. The man who had been a coiled spring of rage became a statue of lethargy. Ilara watched this with a growing sense of unease. "Is he ill?" she asked Mrs. Halloway as the woman turned to leave. "Mr. Sterling is recovering," the housekeeper replied, her eyes darting toward the security camera in the corner of the ceiling. "The medication helps with the neurological strain. See that you don't overstimulate him." Over the next week, the stimulation was all Ilara had to offer. She realized that Julian was living in a sensory vacuum. His food was bland, his clothes were all the same smooth texture, and the house was kept at a constant, unchanging hum. It was a gilded cage, designed to make him forget he was alive. She decided to push back, not with light, not yet, but with the other things. "Today, we're going to the terrace," she announced on the 7th morning. Julian, still in his post-medication fog, frowned. "It's raining." "I know. That's why we're going." She didn't wait for his permission. She stepped closer to him, her heart skipping a beat as she entered his personal space. The scent of him, sandalwood and something metallic, like rain on a hot sidewalk, filled her lungs. She reached out, her hand hovering inches from his elbow. "I'm going to guide you," she said. "If you don't like it, you can fire me." Julian stiffened. He could have pushed her away. He could have shouted for his mother. But the silence of the house had begun to grate on him more than her presence. He stood, his height imposing, and tentatively let his arm rest near hers. He didn't touch her, but the proximity was electric. Ilara could feel the heat radiating from him, a stark contrast to the chilled air of the solarium. They walked slowly through the gallery. The marble was slick and cold. As they reached the glass doors to the terrace, Ilara pushed them open. The sound hit them first, the roar of the Hudson River below, amplified by the wind and the rhythmic percussive beat of a heavy spring rain hitting the slate tiles. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, wet earth, and the sharp green tang of the surrounding pine forest. Julian gasped. It was a small, sharp sound, like a man breaking the surface of the water after nearly drowning. He stepped out, the rain immediately spotting his expensive cashmere sweater. "Describe it," he commanded, but the bite was gone from his voice. It was a plea. Ilara led him to the edge of the stone balustrade. She took his hand. His skin was rougher than she expected, the calluses of a man who used to handle tools and models still present, and placed his palm against the wet basalt. "The rain isn't just falling," she said, leaning in so he could hear her over the wind. Her breath brushed the side of his neck, and she saw the goosebumps rise on his skin. "It's reclaiming the stone. The slate is turning from a dull grey to a deep, bruised purple. The river below is a churning mass of mercury, the whitecaps looking like torn lace against the dark water." Julian's fingers curled around the edge of the stone. "The wind," he whispered. "It sounds different." "It sounds like a cello," Ilara said. "A low, vibrating note that changes every time it hits the angles of the house. You designed these eaves, Julian. You created a giant instrument, and the storm is playing it." Julian stood there, his head tilted back, his face upturned to the sky. Water beaded on his lashes, trailing down his sharp cheekbones. For the first time, he wasn't a billionaire or a victim. He was just a man feeling the weight of the atmosphere. Suddenly, a gust of wind caught them, a violent surge that made Ilara stumble on the wet tiles. Julian's hand shot out, his reflexes surviving the darkness. He caught her by the waist, pulling her flush against him to steady her. The world stopped. The roar of the rain faded into the background, replaced by the thudding of two hearts out of sync. Ilara's hands were flat against his chest, feeling the hard, steady rhythm of his life beneath the damp wool. His face was inches from hers, his clouded eyes searching for a shape he couldn't see, but his body knew exactly where she was. The tension was thick, a physical cord stretched between them, humming with the frequency of a secret. "You're shivering," Julian murmured. His voice was no longer a rasp. It was a low, resonant vibration that she felt in her own bones. "It's the cold," she lied. "No," he said, his grip tightening just a fraction on her waist. "It's not." He reached up, his fingers grazing her jawline, moving with a tentative, heartbreaking slowness. He was memorizing the architecture of her face, the curve of her cheek, the bridge of her nose. His touch was light, but it felt like a brand. "Tell me," he whispered, his thumb brushing the corner of her lip. "What color is the light right now? I know I'm not supposed to ask, but tell me." Ilara looked up at the sky, a chaotic, beautiful mess of charcoal clouds and a sudden, sharp sliver of silver where the sun was trying to break through the veil. "It's the color of a promise," she said, her voice cracking, "the kind of light that makes you believe the dark was just a dream." Julian's hand dropped. The medication seemed to win a sudden battle in his mind, his eyes glazing over as he pulled back, the wall slamming back into place. "Take me inside," he said, his voice flat and dead once more. "My mother will be looking for us." Undine, as they stepped back into the sterile silence of the solarium, Ilara felt the weight of the silver watch in her pocket. It felt heavier now, as if the spring inside had shifted. She had seen the man behind the mask, and she had seen the cage his mother had built for him. But as Julian sat back in his chair, waiting for the next pill to dull the world she had just shown him, Ilara realized the most dangerous thing in the house wasn't the darkness. It was the fact that she was starting to love the man who lived in it. The door clicked shut behind her as she left, but she didn't see the shadow of Eleanor Sterling standing at the end of the darkened hallway, her eyes fixed on the security monitor that had captured every second of their time on the terrace. The silence of the house felt like a threat. The first crack in the marble had appeared, and Ilara knew that when the stone finally broke, the fallout would bury them both. The morning after the storm, the Sterling estate felt different. The air was no longer just cold, it was expectant. Ilara sat at her small desk in the guest wing, the silver watch resting in her open palm. She ran her thumb over the cracked crystal, the rhythmic motion grounding her. She thought of the way Julian had held her on the terrace, the strength in his hands, the way his breath had hitched when she mentioned the light. He wasn't a statue. He was a man buried alive in his own legacy, and for the first time, Ilara felt the weight of her role. She wasn't just his eyes, she was his bridge back to the world. When she entered the solarium at 8 a.m., she didn't wait for his command. "The library," she said, her voice clear and ringing against the marble. "We're going to the library today, Julian." Julian, who had been sitting in his usual lethargic slump, tilted his head. The cloudiness in his eyes seemed a fraction less dense today. "The library is for researchers and dead men, Vance. Everything in there is digital now anyway." "Not everything," Ilara countered, walking toward him. She noticed the blue pill sitting on the side table, untouched. A small victory flared in her chest. "The original folios of your father's sketches are there. The physical models of the Hudson Project. You can't touch a digital file." She offered her arm. Julian hesitated, his hand hovering in the air between them. The memory of the terrace hung in that space, the heat of their bodies, the scent of the rain. Finally, he reached out, his fingers sliding into the crook of her elbow. His touch was lighter than before, more conscious. As they walked through the house, Ilara didn't just lead him, she narrated the journey. "We're passing through the transition gallery now," she said softly. "The floor changes from marble to reclaimed white oak here. Can you feel the shift in the vibration of your steps? The wood is softer, warmer. It absorbs the sound instead of throwing it back at you. To your left, there's a series of floor-to-ceiling windows. The morning sun is hitting the glass at a 30-degree angle, creating long, amber rectangles on the floor that look like pools of honey." Julian slowed his pace, his shoes scuffing the oak. "I remember the oak," he whispered. "It was sourced from an old barn in Vermont. I wanted the gallery to feel like a breath after the coldness of the entrance." "It does," Ilara said. "It feels like a heartbeat." They reached the library, a 2-story cavern of dark mahogany and leather. The smell was the first thing that hit them: vanilla, old paper, tobacco, and the faint, sweet scent of beeswax polish. "Describe the height," Julian commanded, though his tone was no longer a challenge. It was a hunger. Ilara guided him to the center of the room. The ceiling is 20 feet up, coffered in dark wood. There's a spiral staircase made of wrought iron that winds up to the second tier. It looks like a ribbon of black ink frozen in the air. The books, they aren't just rows of paper, they're textures. The leather bindings are pebbled and cool, while the buckram ones are rough, like sun-dried linen. She led his hand to a shelf, placing his fingers on a massive leather-bound volume. "This is the 19th century atlas of the city. Feel the gold leaf on the spine. It's raised just a tiny bit, like braille for the soul." Julian's fingers traced the letters. A look of intense concentration crossed his face, a shadow of the genius who had once commanded an empire of design. "I used to spend hours here," he said, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "Before the accident. I thought I knew this room, but I only knew how it looked. I didn't know how it felt." "That's because you were looking with your eyes, not your skin," Ilara said. She watched him as he explored the shelf, his movements becoming more fluid, less robotic. The lethargy that usually gripped him by this hour was absent. He was waking up. "Julian," she said, her voice dropping, "why do you take the medication? The blue pill Mrs. Halloway brings?" Julian's hand stilled on a book spine. His jaw tightened. "My mother says it's for the phantom pains, the neurological static. After the blast at the site, my brain, it doesn't know how to handle the silence. It invents things, flashes of fire, screams. The medication keeps the ghosts away." "But it keeps the world away too," Ilara said, stepping closer. "Does it hurt right now without it?" Julian turned toward her. They were close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the slight pulse in his throat. "No," he said softly. "Right now, all I hear is your voice, and it's clearer than the silence." The moment was interrupted by the heavy click of heels on the parquet. Eleanor Sterling stood in the doorway, her presence like a sudden drop in temperature. She looked at her son's hand on the shelf, then at Ilara's proximity to him. Her eyes were chips of blue flint. "Julian," Eleanor said, her voice perfectly modulated, "you missed your morning briefing with the board, and your medication is still in the solarium. Mrs. Halloway was quite concerned." Julian pulled his hand back, the mask of the broken sun sliding back into place. "We were just exploring, Mother." "Exploring is for children and tourists," Eleanor said, stepping into the room. She didn't look at Ilara, but her words were directed at her. "Julian is a busy man with a recovery schedule that must be strictly followed. Ilara, I hired you to provide descriptions, not to disrupt his medical care." "He was describing the white oak to me, Mrs. Sterling," Ilara said, her voice tight. "He was remembering his own work." "Remembering is a form of mourning," Eleanor said sharply. "He needs to focus on the present." "Julian, come. Dr. Aris is waiting for your checkup." As Julian was led away by his mother, he didn't look back, but his hand trailed along the mahogany table for as long as he could reach it, a silent anchor to the world Ilara was trying to give him. Left alone in the library, Ilara felt a cold shiver of suspicion. She began to wander the room, her restorative instincts kicking in. She noticed a side table cluttered with mail, unopened envelopes addressed to Julian. Most were from his former colleagues, some from architectural firms in Europe. She picked one up. It was a letter from a friend, judging by the handwriting. It had been opened, then roughly resealed with a sliver of tape. Ilara's heart began to race. She moved to the desk where Julian's briefings were kept. There was a ledger, a thick book bound in black leather. She opened it, expecting to see design notes. Instead, she found a series of financial summaries and board meeting minutes. She scanned the pages, her architectural training allowing her to read between the lines of the corporate jargon. The Hudson Project, Julian's masterpiece, was being systematically dismantled. His shares were being diluted, his patents transferred to a holding company controlled by Eleanor. But it was the date of the accident that stopped her breath. The blast had happened on June 14th, 3 days before Julian was set to testify in a safety audit regarding the Hudson site, the same audit that had eventually found Ilara's father solely responsible for the structural failures that led to the company's bankruptcy. Ilara gripped the edge of the desk, the room spinning. Her father hadn't been the one who cut corners. Julian hadn't been the one who failed. They were both being manipulated by a force much larger and colder than a simple business deal. The silence Julian lived in wasn't just a result of his blindness. It was a fortress built by his mother to keep him from realizing he was being robbed of his legacy, and perhaps to keep him from remembering what really happened on the day the world went dark. Suddenly, the library doors creaked. Ilara shoved the ledger back into its place, her heart hammering against her ribs like a drum. Mrs. Halloway stood there, her face a mask of polite indifference. "The mistress would like to know if you finished your morning session, Miss Vance. It's time for Julian's rest." "I was just looking at the architecture," Ilara said, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes," the housekeeper said, her eyes lingering on the ledger. "The architecture of this house is very specific. Everything has its place. I suggest you remember yours." Ilara walked out of the library, the silver watch in her pocket feeling like a live coal. She had come here for a paycheck, for a way to restore her father's name. But as she looked down the long, cold hallway toward Julian's room, she realized she was no longer an observer. She was the only person in the house who saw the truth, and in a house built on shadows, the truth was a death sentence for the heart. The evening was a blur of heightened awareness. During their dinner session, which took place in a dining room so large their voices echoed, Ilara watched Julian. He was medicated again, his movements slow, his eyes distant. "Julian," she whispered when the staff cleared the first course. "Tell me about the Hudson site. Tell me about the day of the blast." Julian's fork clattered against the fine bone china. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. I don't remember the blast," he said, his voice thick. "Just the sound of the glass, like 10,000 bells ringing at once. And then the dark." "Think back," Ilara pressed, leaning across the table, her hand almost touching his. "Before the bells. What did you see on the blueprints that morning? You were going to a meeting." I was going to meet a man," Julian said, his brow furrowing as he fought through the fog of the pill. "An engineer, Vance." He had found a discrepancy in the steel tension. He was scared. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. Her father. He had gone to Julian to help, not to sabotage. "And then?" she urged. "And then—" "The elevator," Julian whispered, his breathing becoming shallow. The smell of gas. I tried to reach for the emergency brake, but someone was already there. Julian, stop! Eleanor Sterling was at the head of the table, her face a mask of fury. He is not to be questioned about the accident. It triggers his episodes. Miss Vance, leave this room immediately. Julian slumped back in his chair, his eyes rolling back as the neurological strain took hold. Or perhaps the medication finally suppressed the memory she had dared to poke. Ilara stood, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. She looked at Eleanor, a woman who would blind her own son to keep her power, and then at Julian, the man she was falling for, who was being erased minute by minute. She didn't speak. She turned and walked out, but she didn't go to her room. She went to the basement, not the archives, but the Sterling estate's own sub-level where the mechanical heart of the house lived. She needed to see the original plans. She needed to see if the architecture of the house matched the architecture of the lie. The cliffhanger hung in the air like the smell of ozone before a storm. Ilara was no longer just a narrator. She was a saboteur in the palace of the blind, and the clock in her pocket was finally, fitfully, beginning to tick. The mechanical heart of the Sterling estate did not beat. It hummed with a low-frequency vibration that Ilara felt in the soles of her feet long before she reached the sub-level. Down here, the white marble and glass of the upper floors gave way to raw, board-formed concrete and exposed conduits of brushed steel. It was a space of brutal utility, a stark reminder of the engineering prowess that had built the Sterling name. Ilara moved through the dimly lit corridor, her flashlight cutting a lonely path through the dark. She was looking for the archive room, the physical one, where the hard copies of the Hudson Project were kept before everything was moved to the cloud. She found it behind a heavy, fireproof door. Inside, the air was dry and smelled of ozone and static. Rows of grey filing cabinets stood like sentinels in the dark. Her fingers trembled as she pulled open the drawer labeled Hudson, Structural Audits. She began to flip through the folders, the rhythmic thwap-thwap of the paper, the only sound in the tomb-like silence. Then she saw it. A folder bound in red tape, marked Confidential, Counter-signature required. She pulled it out and spread the blueprints across a metal drafting table. These weren't the finalized versions she had studied in the archives. These were the working drafts, annotated in a familiar, precise hand, her father's hand. Next to his notes were Julian's initials, J.S., in a bold, assertive scrawl. They hadn't been enemies, they had been working together. Her father had flagged a microfracture in the steel tensioning of the main pylon, a flaw that was being covered up by the supplier. But as she turned the page, she found a memo signed by Eleanor Sterling. Concerns noted. Proceed with original timeline. Adjustments will be made post-inauguration. The date on the memo was 3 days before the blast. Ilara felt a wave of nausea. The explosion hadn't been an accident, and it hadn't been her father's incompetence. It had been a calculated risk that Eleanor Sterling had turned into a tactical erasure. She hadn't just saved the company. She had used the tragedy to bury the one person who knew the truth, her own son's collaborator. And in the process, she had buried her son's sight to keep him from asking questions. A soft sound from the doorway made Ilara's heart stop. She clicked off the flashlight, her breath hitching in her throat. The silence was absolute for a heartbeat, and then she heard the rhythmic tap-slide of a carbon fiber cane. Julian was here. "Vance!" his voice called out. It wasn't the drugged, slurred tone of the afternoon. It was sharp, clear, and vibrating, with an intensity that made the small room feel claustrophobic. "I know you're in here. I can hear the way the air moves around you." Ilara stepped out from behind the drafting table, her hands tucked into the pockets of her cardigan, her fingers white-knuckled around the silver watch. "How did you find me?" "I designed the acoustics of this house, remember?" Julian said, stepping into the room. He wasn't wearing his shades. In the dim, ambient light from the hallway, his clouded eyes looked like twin moons. I know where every door leads, and I know when someone is breathing in my father's secrets. He moved toward her with an uncanny precision, stopping only inches away. The scent of him, now familiar like rain and cold metal, surrounded her. "Why are you down here?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I was looking for the truth," Elara said, her heart hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. "The truth about what happened to my father, and what happened to you." Julian's jaw tightened. He reached out, his hand finding her shoulder. He didn't pull her closer, but the weight of his touch was a claim. "My mother says your father was a careless man. She says he was the reason I woke up in a world of grey." "She lied, Julian," Elara said, her voice cracking. "My father was the one who tried to stop it. He came to you. He trusted you." Julian's hand moved from her shoulder to her neck, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was no longer tentative. It was searching, desperate. "I remember a voice," he whispered, "in the elevator before the bells. It wasn't my mother's. It was a man. He said, 'They're going to let it fail, Julian. We have to stop them.'" He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The proximity was a physical ache. "I've spent 6 months in the dark, Vance. Everyone tells me what to feel, what to eat, what to remember. You're the only thing that feels real, the only thing that doesn't smell like a hospital or a lie." "Julian," she whispered, her hands finding his chest, "if I tell you everything, it will destroy this house. It will destroy your mother." "This house is already a ruin," Julian said, his voice thick with a sudden, raw emotion. "And my mother, she's the one who turned off the lights." He tilted his head, his lips just inches from hers. The tension between them was no longer just the attraction of two lonely souls. It was the friction of two truths colliding. Elara knew she should pull away. She was a Vance, and he was a Sterling. Her father's blood was on his family's hands. But as Julian reached out and cupped her face, his fingers trembling with the effort of seeing her, the weight of her secret became unbearable. "Tell me," he pleaded. "Tell me what you see right now." Elara looked at him, at the brilliance trapped behind the grey, at the man who was finally, painfully waking up. "I see a man who is tired of being a ghost," she said. "And I see a woman who is terrified that if she kisses him, she'll never be able to leave." Julian didn't wait. He closed the distance, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both a question and a confession. It was slow, tasting of salt and desperation, a bridge built in the dark. In that moment, the blueprints on the table and the silver watch in her pocket didn't matter. There was only the heat of him, the way he pulled her against the hard line of his body as if she were the only thing keeping him from drifting into the void. But as they pulled apart, the cold reality of the basement returned. "I found a memo," Elara whispered against his skin. "Your mother knew about the fracture. She let it happen." Julian went still. The lethargy that the pills usually provided was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. "She wouldn't," he breathed, though the way he said it suggested he already knew she would. "I have the proof, Julian. But there's something else, something I haven't told you." Before she could say her name, before she could tell him she was the daughter of the man he remembered, the heavy steel door of the archive room swung open. The overhead lights flickered on, blinding in their intensity. Eleanor Sterling stood in the doorway. She wasn't alone. 2 men in dark suits, security or perhaps something more corporate, stood behind her. Her face was a mask of cold, regal disappointment. "I warned you, Elara," Eleanor said, her voice like the snap of a winter branch. "I told you not to try to fix him. I told you to stay in your place." Julian stepped in front of Elara, his arms shielding her. "She's not a servant, Mother, and she's not the one who's been lying to me." "Julian, you're confused," Eleanor said, stepping into the room. She didn't look at the blueprints on the table. She looked only at Ilara. The medication is wearing off. You're having an episode. Miss Vance here has been manipulating you from the start. Did she tell you who she really is? Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. She's a restorationist, Mother, Julian spat. She's the only one who helped me see. She's the daughter of Arthur Vance, Eleanor said, the words hitting the room like a physical blow. The man who sabotaged your sight. The man who nearly killed you to hide his own embezzlement. She didn't come here to narrate the world for you, Julian. She came here for revenge. Julian's body went rigid. He didn't move, but the air between him and Ilara suddenly felt like a wall of ice. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. He didn't turn to look at her. He didn't need to. "Are you his daughter?" The silence that followed was the heaviest of Ilara's life. She looked at the man she had just kissed, the man she had tried to save, and she saw the shadow of 1,000 lies falling between them. "Yes," she whispered. "But I didn't come for revenge. I came because I thought you were the one person who could help me find the truth." "The truth?" Eleanor laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "The truth is that you are a trespasser in this house, and you are finished. Take her." The two men stepped forward. "No," Julian said, his voice booming in the small room. He turned, his clouded eyes finding Ilara's face with a terrifying accuracy. "Let her go." "Julian, she lied to you," Eleanor pressed. "Everyone in this house lied to me," Julian roared. He reached out, his hand finding the edge of the drafting table and shoving it aside with a violent crash. "Get out, both of you, now." "Julian!" Ilara started, her hand reaching for him. "Go, Ilara," he said, his voice breaking, "before I forget that you were the only thing I liked about the dark." The men led Ilara out of the basement, her feet heavy on the concrete. As she was escorted toward the gates of the estate, she felt the silver watch in her pocket. It was ticking, a faint rhythmic sound that only she could hear. She was being cast out, her father's name still tarnished, the man she loved believing she was a traitor. But as the iron gates of the Sterling estate swung shut behind her, Ilara looked back at the glass fortress on the cliff. The shades in the solarium were up. A single brilliant beam of moonlight was hitting the glass, and for the first time in 6 months, the house wasn't hiding in the shadows. The crack in the marble had finally become a chasm, and as Ilara stood in the rain, she knew that the story wasn't over. The weight of the silence had been broken, and now the world was finally going to hear the sound of the truth. The iron gates of the Sterling estate didn't just close. They rang with a sound of finality that vibrated in Ilara's teeth. She stood on the rain-slicked curb, her single suitcase at her feet, watching the headlights of the black sedan disappear back up the winding drive. The house, that monument of glass and steel, loomed on the cliffside like a lighthouse that had intentionally gone dark. The cold Hudson wind whipped through her thin coat, but she didn't feel it. She was still burning from the basement, the heat of Julian's lips, the sudden, jagged ice of his betrayal, and the way the word Vance had fallen from Eleanor Sterling's mouth like a curse. She was back where she started, invisible, a ghost in a city of millions. The taxi ride back to her father's old workshop took 40 minutes. The driver didn't speak, and Ilara was grateful for the silence. She watched the city blur past the window, a smear of neon reds and cold blues reflecting on the wet pavement. She thought of Julian in that house. Alone in the dark he now knew was a lie. She thought of his hand on the basalt stone and the way he had said she was the only thing that felt real. The workshop was exactly as she had left it, though the air felt even thinner now. It smelled of cedar shavings, oil, and the slow, patient decay of things that had lost their purpose. Ilara didn't turn on the lights. She walked through the shadows, her footsteps echoing on the floorboards her father had laid 40 years ago. She sat at the workbench and pulled the silver watch from her pocket. It was heavier now, or perhaps it was just her heart that was heavier. She set it on the scarred wood and leaned her head into her hands. She had the evidence. The digital recorder in her pocket contained the audio of the memo she'd found, the confession of Eleanor's negligence. But she had lost the man. She had let him believe she was a predator, a girl who had used his blindness to sneak into his bed and his bank account. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and picked up a jeweler's loop. With a ragged exhale, she began to do the only thing she knew how to do when the world broke. She began to work. She pried open the back of the silver watch. The red clay of the Hudson site was still there, a dry, rust-colored silt clogging the delicate gears. "Everything can be restored," her father used to say. "You just have to find the piece that stopped moving." Back at the Sterling estate, the silence was no longer a vacuum. It was a war zone. Julian sat in the solarium. For the first time since the accident, he had refused to let the housekeepers draw the shades. He sat in the center of the room, bathed in the pale, unforgiving light of a moon that sat high over the river. He could feel the light on his skin, a faint, cool pressure that Elara had taught him to recognize. The blue pill sat on the side table, a small, toxic moon of its own. A shadow fell across the doorway. He didn't need eyes to know it was his mother. He could hear the specific rhythmic tap of her heels, a sound that used to represent safety, but now sounded like the ticking of a countdown. "You haven't taken your supplement, Julian," Eleanor said. Her voice was soft, maternal, and utterly devoid of warmth. "I'm done with the supplements, Mother," Julian said. His voice was low, a resonant growl that seemed to vibrate the glass walls. "I'm done with the fog. I want to feel the static. I want to hear the bells." "You're being hysterical. That girl, she got under your skin. She used your vulnerability to twist your memories. Arthur Vance was a thief, Julian. He died trying to cover his tracks." Then why?" Julian said, standing up, his height filling the room. "Did I find a memo in the archive today? A memo with your signature, dated 3 days before the blast." The silence that followed was different from any silence Julian had ever known. It was the silence of a structure about to collapse. He heard his mother's breath hitch, a tiny microscopic catch in her throat. To anyone else, it would be nothing. To a man who had lived in the dark for 6 months, it was a confession. "You were in the archives," Eleanor whispered. "She took you there. She showed me the world, Mother. You just showed me the exit." Julian walked toward her, his cane abandoned. He didn't need it. He knew this room. He knew the angles of his own betrayal. He stopped inches from her, his clouded eyes staring through her. "Where is she?" "She is gone, Julian, where she belongs, back to the gutter her father built for her." "She didn't leave empty-handed," Julian said, a cold smile touching his lips. "She left me with something I haven't had in a long time. Clarity." He turned and walked past her, his shoulder brushing hers, a deliberate act of defiance. He made his way down the stairs, through the white oak gallery that now felt like a hollow rib cage, and into the library. He didn't need to see the books. He followed the scent. Vanilla, old paper, and the faint, lingering trace of lavender, the scent of Elara's skin. He moved to the shelf where she had placed his hand on the atlas. He reached behind the massive volumes, his fingers searching the gaps. His fingertips brushed something cold and plastic. A digital recorder. He pulled it out, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt the buttons, finding the play icon. Elara's voice filled the room. It wasn't the voice of a narrator. It was the voice of a woman who was breaking. "Julian, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone. I didn't come here to hurt you. I came to find out why my father died with a smile on his face, thinking he had saved the man who was building the future. I found the memo. I found the truth. Your mother knew about the tension fracture. She let it happen because the insurance was worth more than the project. My father didn't sabotage the site. He died trying to reach the emergency manual override in the elevator. He died trying to save you." There was a pause on the recording, the sound of a sharp, wet intake of breath. "I love the way you listen to the wind," she whispered. "I love the way you see light in the dark. Don't let her take that from you. Don't go back to the silence." The recording clicked off. Julian gripped the device so hard the plastic groaned. The static he had feared, the neurological strain, hit him all at once. But it wasn't fire, and it wasn't screams. It was memory. He remembered the elevator. He remembered the smell of ozone. He remembered a man's hand, rough, calloused, smelling of old paper and cedar, shoving him into the corner of the cab as the cables snapped. "Stay down, son. I've got the brake." Arthur Vance hadn't been a thief. He had been a shield. Julian let out a roar of grief and fury that echoed through the empty library, shattering a glass vase on the mahogany table. He wasn't a broken man anymore. He was a man who had finally been given a map out of the dark. In the workshop, Ilara was at the final stage of the restoration. She had cleaned every gear. She had replaced the hairspring. She had spent hours under the lamp, her eyes burning, her fingers cramped. She picked up the tiny balance wheel, the heart of the watch. She placed it into the movement. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The watch lay dead in her palm, a silver husk of a dead man's time. Then she gave it a gentle, rhythmic shake. Tick. The sound was tiny, no louder than a pinprick in the silence of the shop. Tick, tick, tick. Ilara burst into tears. The sound of the watch was the sound of her father's heartbeat. It was the sound of 5 years of silence finally breaking. The time was moving again. But as she sat there, the watch ticking in her hand, the door of the workshop groaned on its hinges. Ilara stood, wiping her eyes, her heart jumping into her throat. "We're closed," she said, her voice trembling. The figure in the doorway was tall, silhouetted against the street lamps outside. He wore a dark coat, and he stood with a stillness that was both terrifying and familiar. He didn't have a cane. He didn't have a guide. He stepped into the shop, the scent of rain and cold metal following him. "I followed the sound of the ticking," Julian said. His voice was raw, stripped of the billionaire's arrogance and the victim's lethargy. He stood in the center of the dusty shop, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere near her heart. "Julian," Ilara whispered, the watch still pulsing in her hand. How are you here?" "I told my driver to take me to the only place in the city where people still fix things," Julian said. He took a step forward, his movements confident, guided by the acoustics of the room. "I heard the recording, Ilara. I remembered the elevator. I remembered your father." He stopped a foot away from her. The space between them was charged with the weight of everything they had lost and everything they had found. "My mother is meeting with the board tomorrow morning," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "She thinks she's going to announce my medical retirement and the final sale of the Hudson site. She thinks I'm still in the dark." He reached out, his hand finding Ilara's face. His thumb brushed the tears on her cheek, his touch so tender it felt like a prayer. "I don't have my sight, Ilara," he whispered, "but for the first time in my life I can see exactly what needs to be done. I need you to be my witness. I need you to stand in that boardroom and tell them what the light looks like when the truth finally hits the glass." Ilara looked at him, at the man who had traveled through the night to find her, who had defied the empire of his own name to stand in a dusty workshop. "They'll destroy us, Julian," she said. "Your mother has the lawyers, the press, the power." "She has the shadows," Julian said, leaning in until their foreheads touched. "But we have the time." He took her hand, the one holding the ticking silver watch, and pressed it against his own chest. The rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the watch merged with the heavy, steady thud of his heart. "Can you hear it?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered. "That's the sound of the world starting again," Julian said. "Don't look back, Ilara. We're going to burn that house down, and from the ashes we're going to build something that never breaks." The cliffhanger hung in the air like a bated breath. Tomorrow, the Sterling Empire would face its reckoning. Tomorrow, the blind man and the invisible girl would step into the light. But tonight, in the silence of the workshop, the only thing that mattered was the sound of two hearts finally beating in sync with the truth. The morning of the winter solstice arrived not with a roar, but with a sharp, crystalline clarity. In the small workshop on Miller Street, the light didn't struggle, it pierced. It cut through the frost on the window pane in jagged diamonds, illuminating the dust motes that danced over Ilara's workbench. The air smelled of cold ozone and the dark, bitter aroma of black coffee. Ilara stood by the window, her coat already buttoned. In her pocket, her fingers were curled around the silver watch. It was warm from her body heat, and the steady, rhythmic tick-tick-tick was a physical pulse against her hip. She felt like she was carrying a heartbeat that didn't belong to her, but to the truth itself. Julian sat at the small kitchen table in the back. He was dressed in a suit of deep navy, the fabric so fine it whispered whenever he moved. He looked different today. The lethargy was gone, replaced by a terrifyingly sharp focus. He wasn't wearing his shades. His clouded eyes were turned toward the window, sensing the direction of the sun with the precision of a sunflower. "The sun is high," Julian said. It wasn't a question. "It's 9:15, Ilara replied, her voice steady. "The board meeting starts in 45 minutes. Julian stood. He didn't reach for a cane. He didn't reach for her arm. He stood with the balance of an architect who understood exactly how the floor beneath him was constructed. "Tell me what the light looks like today, Ilara. One last time before we enter that room." Ilara looked at him, and for a moment the weight of the last few months threatened to overwhelm her. She saw the man who had been a ghost in a glass palace, and she saw the man who was now ready to dismantle it. "It's a hard light, Julian," she said softly. "It's the kind of light that shows every crack in the stone. It's unforgiving, it's white and cold, but it's honest. It makes the shadows long and deep, so you know exactly where the edges are." Julian nodded once. "Good. I'm done with soft edges." They left the shop together. The city outside was a cacophony of sound. The hiss of bus brakes, the distant rhythm of a jackhammer, the frantic chatter of people rushing toward their own tiny versions of the future. To Ilara, it was chaos. To Julian, it was a map. He navigated the sidewalk with a grace that made people stop and stare. He wasn't a blind man being led. He was a man moving through a world he had finally decoded. The Sterling Building stood at the edge of the park, a 50-story monolith of dark glass that seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. As they entered the lobby, the sound changed. The street noise vanished, replaced by the hushed, expensive hum of high-speed elevators and the rhythmic click of polished shoes on granite. The security guard at the desk looked up, his face pale. "Mr. Sterling, we weren't expecting you." "That's the problem with expectations," Julian said, his voice echoing in the vast lobby. "They're usually based on the past. We're here for the 50th floor." The elevator ride was a sensory vacuum. The pressure changed in Ilara's ears as they ascended. She watched the floor numbers glow, 10, 20, 30. Julian stood perfectly still, his head tilted slightly. "The cables are humming at a higher frequency than usual," he murmured. "Maintenance is behind. My mother has been cutting costs even here." The doors slid open with a chime that sounded like a funeral bell. The Sterling boardroom was a glass-walled cage suspended over the city. A dozen men and women sat around a table of polished obsidian, their faces illuminated by the harsh, panoramic light of the winter sun. At the head of the table sat Eleanor Sterling. She was dressed in white, a stark, blinding white that made her look like part of the architecture. She was speaking as they entered. And given Julian's continued neurological decline, the conservatorship is the only logical path to ensure the stability of the Hudson Project and the legacy of... The heavy glass doors swung open. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happened when a structural beam finally snapped under the weight of a lie. Eleanor froze, her hand hovering over a leather-bound folder. Her eyes darted from Julian to Ilara, and for a split second, the mask of the Ice Queen shattered. There was terror in her eyes, the raw, primitive terror of a woman who realized the ghost she had created had walked back into the room. "Julian," she said, her voice a fragile reed, "you should be resting. The doctor said..." "The doctor said whatever you paid him to say, Mother," Julian said. He walked into the room, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the hardwood. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the table. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the obsidian. "I've had enough rest. I'm wide awake now." Moo, one of the board members, an older man with silver hair, cleared his throat. "Julian, we were just discussing the medical reports. Your mother says the neurological strain is significant." "The only strain I'm feeling, George, is the weight of the silence in this house," Julian said. He turned his head toward the board. "My mother has spent 6 months trying to convince you that I am a broken instrument. She's tried to convince me that the dark was my own fault, but I'd like you all to meet someone." He reached back, and Ilara stepped forward. She felt 100 eyes on her, judgmental, curious, cold. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver watch. She set it on the table. The tick-tick-tick was tiny, but in the pressurized silence of the boardroom, it sounded like a hammer. "This is Ilara Vance," Julian said. "The daughter of Arthur Vance." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Eleanor stood up, her face white with fury. "This is an outrage. This girl is a grifter. She's the daughter of the man who sabotaged our company." "She's the woman who restored my sight," Julian roared, his voice shaking the glass walls. "Not my eyes, Mother. My vision." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the small digital recorder. He set it next to the watch. "Before we vote on the sale of the Hudson site," Julian said, "I think we should listen to a recording from the archive. Not the digital one you scrubbed, Mother, the physical one you forgot I designed to be redundant." He pressed play. The room filled with the sound of the archives, the low hum of the basement, the rustle of paper. And then Eleanor's voice, cold and clinical, discussing the insurance payout for the Hudson site, discussing the necessary sacrifice of the structural integrity to meet the quarterly projections. The board members looked at each other. The air in the room became heavy with the scent of a collapsing empire. "It's a deep fake," Eleanor hissed, but her voice was trembling. "It's a fabrication by the Vance girl." "I have the memo too," Ilara said, her voice clear and resonant. She pulled the folder from her bag and slid it across the table. "Signed by you, Mrs. Sterling, 3 days before the blast. My father didn't sabotage that site. He died trying to reach the manual override. He died because you wouldn't let him fix what you had broken." Julian turned back to his mother. He didn't need to see her to know she was defeated. He could hear the way her jewelry clinked as she trembled. He could smell the sharp, sour tang of her panic. "The board will be reviewing these documents immediately," the silver-haired man said, his voice now devoid of warmth for Eleanor. "And the Hudson sale is suspended pending a full criminal investigation." Eleanor looked around the room. She looked at the faces of the people she had controlled for decades, and she saw nothing but mirrors reflecting her own ruin. She looked at Julian, her son, and for the first time she saw the man he had become. Not a design, but a human being, "I did it for you, Julian," she whispered, a final pathetic plea. "I did it to keep the Sterling name alive." "The Sterling name died in that elevator, Mother," Julian said softly. "The only thing left is the truth, and it's much brighter than I expected." He turned away from her. He didn't wait for her to be escorted out. He didn't wait for the lawyers or the police. He reached out his hand, and Ilara took it. They walked out of the boardroom, through the hushed corridors of power, and back toward the elevator. As the doors closed on the 50th floor, Ilara saw Eleanor Sterling sitting alone at the head of the obsidian table, a white statue in a glass cage. When they reached the lobby, the cold winter air hit them like a benediction. They walked toward the park, the snow beginning to fall in fat, lazy flakes that vanished as soon as they touched the pavement. They stopped on a bridge overlooking the frozen pond. The city was a silhouette of charcoal and silver against the grey sky. "What does it look like now?" Julian asked. Ilara looked at the snow, at the way it softened the sharp edges of the skyscrapers. She looked at the people walking their dogs, the children sliding on the ice, the simple, messy beauty of a world that wasn't designed by a billionaire or controlled by a lie. "It looks like a beginning," Ilara said. She pulled the silver watch from her pocket. She held it out to him, placing it in his palm. "I fixed it, Julian. Every gear, every spring. It's exactly the right time." Julian ran his thumb over the crystal. He didn't look at the watch. He looked at her. His clouded eyes seemed to catch a reflection of the snow, a spark of life that hadn't been there before. "I'm going to rebuild the Hudson Project," he said. "But not in glass and steel. We're going to build it in wood and stone. We're going to build something that people can touch, something that feels like the white oak in the gallery." "And the Vance name?" Ilara asked. "The Vance name will be on the cornerstone," Julian said, "right next to mine." He stepped closer, pulling her into the warmth of his coat. The scent of him was different now. No longer the cold metal of the estate, but the cedar and oil of her workshop. "I can't see the snow, Ilara," he whispered, his breath warm against her temple. "But I can feel it. I can feel the way the world is getting quiet. And I can feel you." "I'm right here, Julian," she said, leaning her head against his chest. "I'm not going anywhere." "Tell me," he murmured, his hand finding her jaw, his thumb tracing the curve of her smile. "One last thing. What color is the future?" Ilara looked up at the sky. The clouds were breaking, and a single brilliant ray of sun was hitting the snow, turning the world into a landscape of shimmering, iridescent gold. "It's not one color, Julian," she said, her voice thick with a joy she had never known. "It's all of them. It's every color you've ever forgotten, and a few we're going to invent together." Julian leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't the desperate kiss of the basement or the question of the library. It was an answer. It was a promise. It was the sound of a silence that had finally been filled with the weight of love. As they walked away from the bridge, hand in hand, the silver watch in Julian's pocket continued to tick. It wasn't counting down to a tragedy anymore. It was counting up. It was measuring the seconds of a life that was finally beautifully under construction. The snow continued to fall, covering the city in a blanket of white, and for the first time in 5 years, the silence wasn't a burden. It was a canvas. And Ilara Vance and Julian Sterling were finally ready to start painting.